Hi, you're watching DNA Today, a multi-award-winning genetics podcast where we explore everything to do with genetics, from CRISPR to rare diseases to new research. We have won the Science and Medicine Podcast Award for many years now. We have hundreds of episodes, and we really hope you enjoy these conversations where we dive into so many genetic concepts. I'm Kira Deneen, a certified genetic counselor, and your host. Today's episode, we explore the experiences of individuals who have discovered an unexpected genetic test result, often called a secondary finding. We have a duo today of Jess, who received a secondary finding result, and her genetic counselor, Julie, who works at the National Human Genome Research Institute. Julie and her team focus on the experiences of people who have received secondary findings as part of a research study called the GSRP, which is the Genomic Services Research Program. So Julie and Jess, thank you so much for joining me. For people that aren't watching the video, you're fancy. You're in a studio, you got a green screen behind you. Welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks so much for having us. We're very fortunate to have access to these kinds of facilities here at NHGRI.
Fancy is fun. Thank you for having us, Kira.
Yeah. So Julie, let's start out with just kind of defining a little bit more of what a secondary finding is in the genetic testing space before we launch into Jess's story.
Yeah, that's great. So, I think that a secondary finding can be defined in a lot of different ways depending on where in the genetic and genomic testing space you are. But for our purposes here in GSRP, we use a definition that has been adopted by the American College of Medical Genetics and Genomics, where a secondary finding is a genomic variant, which is a fancy way of saying a DNA test result, that has two main attributes. One, it's unexpected or unanticipated or unrelated to the reason why the person had the testing in the first place. And two, it's medically actionable, meaning that if you were a person who received one of these findings, the implications of learning that information would include taking some healthcare actions that could potentially save or prolong your life. So there's a thing you can do now that you know about this particular genetic result.
Julie, as you said, it's really important to learn about these secondary findings so that we can have medical intervention. Julie, can you tell me a little bit more about why it's important to study people who have received a secondary finding and what your program focuses on within this?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a couple layers to that question. So, I think when we think about secondary findings, the way people find them out is very frequently in this way that we call opportunistic screening. So, opportunistic screening is when you are taking advantage of having some information about a person that, again, was kind of obtained in a not intentional way. And what I mean by that is, if you kind of compare that to the screening that we all, some of the other health screenings that are recommended. So, women over 40 should have mammograms. That's, a very intentional screening program for breast cancer. Secondary findings are obtained through this opportunistic process, which means that if you happen to have the type of DNA testing, which would result in the ability to read through a person's results to ascertain or to find these kinds of differences, you might as well take advantage of that. So that is, again, what we mean by opportunistic screening. I think the reason why it's really important to spend some time and effort on studying these results, people who've received results in this way, is that I think the puck we're skating towards is more intentional population screening, meaning that we would kind of systematically assess people's genomic risks, risks for these kinds of things, again, in a systematic and intentional way, where, everyone would participate in this screening program, not just people who happen to have the kind of genetic testing where you could get this kind of finding. And so we have kind of a preview by studying people who've received secondary findings. We have a kind of a preview or a prelude to what a population-based genetic screening program might look like and what that might mean for people and what some of the barriers might be or concerns or problems that might come up if we were to think about, if tomorrow I could wave a magic wand and everybody could have, the kind of testing that Jessica had and get access to those kinds of results. So that's a major reason why it's important, to study folks like Jess who've received these kinds of findings.
Yeah, so let's launch into it, Jess. It's amazing that you have joined us so we could learn a little bit more about your experience and your family's experience, because we can talk about these concepts, Julie and I, and then it seems a little abstract, but I think it really makes it much more clear for people when they can hear another human who has had this experience. So tell us a little bit about your secondary finding. I mean, what did you discover and how did that happen?
So I took an ancestry test, just one of those things that a lot of us do. And there was a little box on the test that said, check here if you want to be included in research studies. And I thought, oh, that sounds really cool. And so I checked that box, and the ancestry test returned a finding that said that I had a genetic difference, is that correct, Julie?
Yeah.
In the ApoB gene, which basically means I have FH. So it's familial hypercholesterolemia. And mine is different in the sense that a lot of people who have FH have a difference in a different part, essentially, than mine is, where my difference is found. And so it told me that my high cholesterol and that of my family members is caused by a specific genetic difference.
When you say it's different than most people with FH, is that because it's in a different gene? I'm trying to remember like all the different genes that play a role in FH. Julie, I might have to tag you in on this one. I'm not sure.
Why don't, Jess, you go first and then I can jump in.
Okay,
You're becoming a real expert in this, which I think is great.
I'm going to try this. So my 4 kids who were found to also have this, I have 6 children, and the 4 who were found to have this condition were with me yesterday at the NIH and were able to receive care and testing. And the way that the doctor explained it to them is that there's ships going into a dock. And so a lot of people have trouble with their docks. We have trouble with our ships. And so that was a fascinating way of explaining it. And he was able to give a visual and a picture.
Yeah. I don't have too much to add to that. I think that when we think about familial hypercholesterolemia, it's a condition that can be caused by variants in a couple of different genes. Some of them have to do with the cholesterol receptor, and some of them have to do with kind of cholesterol processing and metabolism, which is where you guys are at, is in that cholesterol processing and metabolism. And so the variant that was found in you is a less frequent cause for FH, but it's incredibly well known that if you have this specific, and the doctor told you it's like a one letter difference, right, in your DNA, that is enough to cause this problem with the boats of your cholesterol not being able to dock and get taken out of the body. And it's very well known and is present in many thousands of people.
A lot of people with FH are underdiagnosed. Like there's much more people out there that have FH that have not been diagnosed. I think it's something that is often missed. Jess, what was your experience in terms of you get this result through a direct consumer test where you probably spit it in, you sent it off a couple weeks or months later, you got these results. What was your next step? I mean, you must have been surprised because that's what a secondary finding is, surprising.
Yep.
So what did you do next?
Well, I believe I got a call from you. And, this information that I had no context for didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And so this process has been incredibly helpful in that Julie has been able to walk alongside of me and my kids as we go through this to explain what's going on and what that means. And that was really helpful for us because we had never heard of FH. And so having her to walk us through what that looked like was incredibly helpful. And I love genetic counselors who I have had contact with. I need to breathe.
Yeah, all good. All
good. Okay. Sorry, centering my brain.
take a second.
Mm-hmm. It was a big process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was a big process.
I think my tendency with things like this is to smile and say, oh, okay, and take in the information. And it takes a little while to be able to work through that in my mind of what does this mean? What is this going to mean for myself and for my children? We have this thing that I have never heard of before. What does this mean for our life? And so having someone like Julie from an organization like the GSRP from the NIH was invaluable, invaluable.
Yeah, and especially because it's not just information for you, but also to say, okay, well, how does this impact your kiddos too? So I think that makes sense that it's just a lot to process. And I'm not a parent myself, but what I hear from a lot of parents is, okay, yeah, talk about me, but focus on the kids. And that's kind of a natural reaction to understand a lot more of that. We talked a little bit about how the other healthcare providers at the NIH were able to explain things, especially for kids, because they're a range of ages. If I'm getting it right, they're kind of like elementary school to teenage years. So, that's a big difference in terms of education levels and just being able to understand that. Have you had conversations about how to share these results with other family members outside of your immediate family?
Yes.
Because as we know in genetics, it's not just the immediate family.
No, and that was something that was incredibly helpful too. Julie has walked us through that and continues to walk us through that because they mapped my extended family. What does this look like? And I was able to have conversations with my cousins, with my dad, with my brothers, with my aunts and uncles of who has experienced what. What has this looked like in our family? This came from my dad on my side, and he is one of 12 siblings. And so it's quite an extensive family. And to be able to see what that looked like and have conversations with them and feel empowered to do that was invaluable. It was fantastic.
Not only just being able to navigate those conversations, but I'm thinking Julie and the other team members also kind of help to facilitate the cascade testing, whereas you're kind of alluding to, okay, your dad's one of 12 and it came from his side, and then you've got siblings. Like this, as you're saying, is a very large family. So that's a lot of people that, I don't know if I should say should be tested, because with genetic testing, we're always kind of saying, okay, it's a person's choice to do that, certainly. But with this, we'll talk about, medical intervention, how important that is. But were there conversations there of just where family members can get testing? Was that through the program, just elsewhere, depending where they live in the world?
Yeah, I think what something they explained yesterday was because we know we have this genetic difference, now we know that the cause of high cholesterol in our family is this genetic difference. And so it's less about the genetic testing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but less about the genetic testing and more about the testing and screening for the high cholesterol and the treatment of that.
Definitely. So, Julie, I'd love to hear from your perspective now in terms of, okay, Jess and her family have this genetic diagnosis. We know about this. As we said at the top, secondary findings often are, and maybe all of them are, correct me, that then there is intervention to be had. Yep. So how does that look like for her family with FH?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, this is one of the things that makes FH such an interesting condition because, many of us here would say, and many folks in genetics might say, if we see a trend where we have multiple generations of a family that appear to have high cholesterol and that high cholesterol is pediatric in onset,
yes,
we're not the first people to make that observation. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Heart Association, lots of different organizations have put out guidelines specifically to address and identify people who might be at risk for FH. Because the truth is, this is not a condition, as Jessica so eloquently put. You don't need a genetic test to know if this is something that you need to be concerned about. You can kind of, your ears should perk up if you see this family history and certain trends in lipid levels and pediatric onset, right? Mm-hmm. So I think this is where genomics is playing an interesting role here because, there are these well-established clinical guidelines to help people get picked up that, are we know, not just from kind of Jessica's anecdotal experience, but there's lots of literature to support the notion that these guidelines are not universally followed just out in the world. But to answer the question that you asked, like what needs to be done now, I think this is another attribute of FH that we spent a lot of time talking about yesterday, and you can certainly elaborate on that, now that you and people in the family are aware that it's not that everyone's eating too many cheeseburgers, right? It's that you have a metabolic difference and you don't metabolize this chemical the same way as everybody else. And that makes you different from 99% of the people who walk into their doctor's offices, where their doctor is just going to be really ready to say, I'm pretty sure you're just eating too many cheeseburgers, right? And so, I think that we know that having a better understanding of the cause is really helpful when we think about different treatment mechanisms. So, more aggressive treatment, trying different types of treatment mechanisms, and starting that treatment earlier, because there's great data about how, getting younger people with their cholesterol under control can really, really reduce the risk of heart disease later. I don't know if you want to kind of give your take on that, but I feel like this is the theme of our conversation yesterday, right?
It is. And that feels empowering to me, to know that this isn't because we're doing something wrong per se. Can it help that we have, and yes, we spoke to a dietitian, we have a plan in place, we have medication, but to know that this is something that we were born with, that is different, feels empowering to me. So I'm glad that I did this DNA test. I'm glad I did this ancestry test, because it has changed the course of my life and my kids' lives. They said to us yesterday, this is a treatable condition. And the fact that it's a treatable condition, that it is pediatric in nature. My dad had a heart attack when he was 39, his first heart attack. My brother had high cholesterol when he was 7. This is something that can change the course of the lives of children and lengthen their lifespan. And to be able to give that to our children is something that was incredibly important to me. And I'm so grateful that I took that test. And I had no idea that this would be the result, that my kids will live longer because of that test.
I mean, that is so powerful. I think genetic testing kits, there's a time and place for these direct consumer kits, right? And I think this is an example of something that you're probably doing kind of for fun, as most people do with the ancestry. And then you ended up learning life-saving information that led you to healthcare providers to then figure out the rest of the journey and testing more people. I mean, I think this is a fantastic example of what good can come out of doing genetic testing kits. We don't know exactly what we're going to learn, but sometimes it's something that you have that intervention for. And I think about long-term, Julie, you kind of mentioned of like with this opportunistic genomic screening, how that's going to help in the future. And learning about cases like this, we're going to learn more about, well, if we start doing much more population studies, what kind of conditions are going to come out? How do we then have our healthcare system set up to be intervening in a positive way? And I think about things like clinical guidelines, especially for general practitioners, that you're just, seeing your GP and you bring this up to them. They have to be familiar with, okay, now is when I refer to a genetics team like us as genetic counselors. So how do you see that kind of developing for conditions like FH? Because we're kind of using that as our example to really, hit things home today.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a major challenge. And I might even punt a little of this back to Jess, because we first spoke for the first time, I think, in late 2021. And here we are in 2024. And so there's been some time, I think, between when you first learned your result, when you became involved in our study, and now, where I feel like, you can correct me, but I feel like maybe now is the moment where pieces are really, like the jigsaw is really coming together. And I wonder about, barriers that you experienced, or kind of if you can kind of elaborate on what's been happening in the intervening time, because I think that might be illuminating for us to think about, where, you're kind of where the rubber meets the road in terms of here is actionable information. Now what? Which is essentially the question that our study is trying to answer, right?
And that is something that I was thinking about yesterday as I was processing what was all going on, that it takes a while to take in this information and integrate it, to understand it, to absorb it. Because as you're going along with your daily life, it feels separate, and yet it's not. I don't remember if I said to you yesterday, this is something that you don't stop to think about. And if you don't stop to think about, it will stop you. And so being able to stop and to think about it and integrate that information and realize that this is something that doesn't have to overtake our lives, but it will if we don't address it. So being able to process it, have that time, have the tools and the resources and the expertise of the people who have been available to us has been priceless. And that has helped along this journey of making this something that we focus on, because life is busy and it is hard sometimes to think of our health. It was for me, hard for me to think of my health as something that I need to prioritize. We do that for our children, but we are worth it. Each one of us is worth it. We are worth prioritizing, and we are worth focusing on this type of thing so that we can go forward and live our life.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think you listed there 4, if I'm going to get them right, 4 really important determinants, which is, again, the $10 word that we use to think of what's between information and action. And it's time, tools, resources, and expertise, which I think gets right back to your question, Kira, of, where do we see this going, or what's the, kind of, so what, why do we study this? It's so that we can, increase people's access to all of these things, right? To help people think about, when is the right time for me to be ready to act on the information? What are the actionable tools that I need? Whether it's how to talk to my doctor, right? Like some sort of like frequently asked questions, or what to say to your doctor. And then for health professionals too, right? Because I think, as I think you were alluding in your question, I think a lot of doctors, I can imagine, could get very intimidated by people coming in with these, weird genetic test results. And you're like, what do I trust? What do I do? Right? This seems like kind of an esoteric area of medicine. And, resources and expertise, right? Because not everyone can get themselves to the specialists that are needed. With familial hypercholesterolemia, it's actually one of the more common things. And most doctors should be familiar with high cholesterol, but there's some other secondary findings that are related to much more rare conditions, and you really need to be followed by, much more, different, even more expert areas of medicine, I guess I would say.
And it takes advocacy, because Jess, from what I learned a little bit earlier before recording, that you had to advocate to your doctor and healthcare providers, and they weren't necessarily like, oh yes, we need to do this and that, they weren't necessarily familiar with it. And then you kind of ended up at the NIH with this, really great treatment and everything. So I think that's a barrier that we have to navigate. And part of it is doing education like this. So, you guys just coming on here and sharing both of your perspectives is really important. And, I think about with this program, investigating the implementation of genomic medicine and kind of taking a step back in this conversation, especially in familial screening, right? I mean, Julie, from your perspective, what kind of things should we be thinking about in this realm with understanding, okay, we need to be looking at familial screening and looking at it in this way? Because as we adopt more and more genetic testing, we're going to get more and more cases like this.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I think, when I think about the implementation, that's another $10 word for how do we actually move knowledge and basic science kind of discoveries out into the world where they do good. And I think Jess has really eloquently described a lot of things that are really worth our time to spend some time thinking about at lots of different levels. So we can think about kind of individual level factors like how ready a person is to receive this information, kind of what their innate response or thought process is to health information generally and how they process risk information and all the things that could be related to that, to kind of community level factors like where do you live? How close do you live to a lipid specialist, for her case? How close do you live to a center of excellence for, one of the another condition, right? Where you might want to do that. What's your access in your level of community? And then, system-wide things that we need to consider, like how ready is the healthcare system to begin to really manage folks and get to those improved outcomes that we're all looking for. So again, I think when we think about this idea, it sounds really great in practice to give people this information. And some people have a very seamless transition from thanks for my result, I'm good, and I know exactly what to do, but that's not most people.
No.
Yeah, right?
Nope. And I feel like I'm one of those people who I take information and I do the thing. And this is not one of those situations.
Yeah.
And so I feel like Julie's been an expert in walking me through that process and understanding not just the science behind it, but the human side behind it. And she has coached me through talking to my family members, and I've encountered like a very small fraction of what I imagine you deal with. And then remembering my own journey when I'm talking to my family members of everything she just spoke about. What are people's response to risk? What are people's response to medical information and interventions? And this is incredibly treatable. It was so encouraging to hear the doctors look at my kids yesterday and say, this is treatable. You have a treatable condition. And to get people to understand that and walk them through that process, I think takes patience, and then removing all of the other barriers and the access. And one of the doctors spoke yesterday about newborn screenings. I would love to
bring that up. It's like you read my mind. I mean, that's where we're headed. So this is going to happen on such a wider scale, like magnify your family experience throughout, the United States, UK, Canada, where we're probably within our lifetimes going to see newborn screening where we're doing genomic screening.
I would love to see that. I think about the results I got yesterday, sitting with this world-renowned cardiologist at the NIH and seeing a picture of my heart and what I need to do going forward, and also what could have been prevented if 44 years ago, just told you how old I am, 44 years ago, as part of the newborn screening, this had been available. This had been something that had been developed. And my kids, thankfully, are young enough that they can benefit from the access and the expertise and the patience of people walking alongside of us as we process and integrate this information into our lives. I am so excited for the day when every parent who takes a child home will know if this is something that their child has, and the life extension, I'm so excited for that. I am so excited for that day.
Really exciting time, I think, in terms of that prevention aspect that you're talking about. We're going to see that in our lifetimes. And I think, the next generation, if some of your kids have biological children, of hopefully having that, if you're a grandparent one day, of like, okay, we know that right away. And we know, for instance, in your family, if that variant has been passed down, that genetic change has been passed down to certain people in that next generation. So I think this is just so promising. And Julie, thank you so much for sharing so much in terms of your genetic counseling perspective. And Jess, I can't thank you enough for just opening up and sharing about your experience, your family. And I'm just thinking about all the thousands of people that are going to be listening to this. And it might lead them to go check this out, right? And say, okay, hey, I have a family history of really young cardiac issues, of people that were diagnosed with high cholesterol at a very young age, like your brother at 7 years old, that this might spark people to go see a genetic provider. And people that maybe are already diagnosed, just wanting to hear your perspective and just being able to resonate with your story. So I can't thank you enough. You both have just been absolutely wonderful. And I think this just really is a great example of how secondary findings can positively impact families' experiences and prevent these conditions. So thank you both so much.
Oh, thank you. And again, we have to thank Jess and her family.
We have to thank Jess.
Yeah.
Yes.
We can't do our research without the participation of people like you. So honestly, it's you're the cornerstone of what we're trying to accomplish here and unpack this complicated issue. So thank you.
Thank you. This has been one of the most incredible experiences. And I looked at my kids yesterday, and I said, one day they're going to, I said to my partner, I said, one day they are going to understand how incredible this day was, how important this day is in their lives, in the lives of their children, and the lives of their grandchildren. And thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for how you do it, because that matters too.
We're so grateful. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's great.
That is just a beautiful sentiment. I think that, genetic counselors can be so useful, and I'm biased because I am one, but I can tell that Julie is just, you are such a great genetic counselor in that aspect of genetic counseling, of the counseling, the guidance, the processing, along with the education, that, you really hit both those boxes. I can very much tell. So thank you both so much for coming on. This has just been a really, really impactful episode.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kara.
Thanks for watching DNA Today. To access all of our episodes, head over to dnatoday.com. We also have a lot of bonus content on there that you can enjoy. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, guest pitches, you name it, send them in to info@dnatoday.com. We'd also really appreciate if you could take a moment to rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to the show. It really helps more nerds like yourself find the show. Also, if you like giveaways and other ways to connect with us, I recommend following us on social. We're at DNA Today Podcast. We also have a Patreon if you want to be the most level involved in the show. That's also at DNA Today Podcast. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Join us next time to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.